The next item of business is the debate on motion 20957 in the name of Jamie Green on fixing Scotland's ferries fiasco. I invite members wishing to participate to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Jamie Green to speak to and move the motion. Up to 6 minutes. Mr Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've been accused over the years about banging on about ferries in this chamber, and you know what? You're absolutely right. Because if you asked me 10 years ago, when I first spoke about ferries in this chamber, if you first told me back then that the 23-year-old MV Caledonian Isles would now be 33 years old, that it would have broken down for 20 months whilst in service, that Hull 802 in Port Glasgow would still not be carrying any passengers, that the Irish berth in Ardrossan would still be lying in tatters, that the Glen Sannock would have launched 7.5 years late and cost £140 million, and that after less than a year in service, it went offline for repairs for months due to design problems. If you told me back then that the Ardrossan ferry would now be sailing out of Troon instead, and all the issues of ferries that I spoke to in my maiden speech would be featuring so prominently in one of my last, if you told me all of that, my answer back then would have been, I really do not hope that be the case for the sake of our island communities. Yet here we are, Presiding Officer, some 10 years on. Same chamber, same me, perhaps aged a little bit since then, but that same sorry saga of cancelled crossings, stranded tourists and missed appointments. We're supposed to be a proud seafaring nation, yet we have a ferry strategy fit for Luxembourg. Let's start with those two now infamous ferries, the Glen Sannock and the Glen Rosa, because everyone from Uns to Arran knows this story, the subject of numerous committee reports, Audit Scotland critique and endless exposés unearthed by journalists and furious and frustrated taxpayers through FOI. This is the stuff that textbooks will use as a case study for decades to teach marine engineers and hopefully governments how not to build a ferry. Both of these ferries were announced with huge amounts of fanfare at SNP conference back in 2015. They were supposed to set sail in 2018. They were both supposed to cost £97 million in total. And I now bet that's a promise the SNP wish it had never made, because 8 years later, some £400 million of taxpayers' money, and the Glen Rosa is still not finished. The Glen Sannock, delivered just last year, has been out of action for over 3 months. In fact, they've had to rip parts out of the Rosa to repair the Sannock. These were supposed to be our flagship net-zero marine machines. They were supposed to cast off the idea of dirty diesel engines in favour of that darling of civil servants, LNG, the same LNG that caused so much of the delay and so many problems. And for what purpose, Presiding Officer? We're not even producing LNG in Scotland. It gets shipped in from Qatar to a terminal in Kent. It gets driven 460 miles in a diesel road tanker to Scotland, and even then we've got nowhere to store it. And barely, if ever, used on the ferry it was designed to be used on. A ferry which was designed for a harbour which it could not sail from. A genius idea, if ever I've heard one. And of course there is Ferguson Marine Shipyard in my own backyard of Inverclyde, nationalised by this government in 2019. Since then, 4 chief executives sacked or resigned, £3 million paid in salaries, golden hellos, golden goodbyes, bonuses and consultancy fees. 6 transport secretaries later, and not one has ever resigned. But I would say we can be grateful that the current Transport Secretary has shown determination and commitment to get stuff done, to her credit, in my view. Presiding Officer, I am delighted with the announcement yesterday of the 4 new vessels being built at the yard. It is exactly the type and profile of work which I think the yard can excel in, and I hope we agree with that. But it needs to get the contract first. And speaking to people in the yard last night, many are indeed sceptical about the government's announcement yesterday, because the first stage of the SVRP was awarded to Gdansk, not to Greenock. Other contracts have been awarded to Turkey. We called in this place for a direct award, including many from the SNP backbenches, for a direct award on all of these occasions, and the government replied that they just could not do it. And now we are told they can. But there's a massive difference between announcing an intention to award a contract and actually announcing the award of a contract. Yesterday we heard the latter, not the former. So we have no idea if ministers have sought CMA approval or it has been denied or granted. None of that was in the statement. How do we know that it will not be denied again? We've heard the words TCAL and state aid bandied around this place for over a decade as to why direct award was problematic. Now, I may be long in the tooth or even a little bit suspicious, but I will believe it when I see it, because the yard deserves nothing less. I'll sum up my motion today on why it was entirely right to use my first and last Lib Dem party business slot to focus on the plight of Scotland's island communities. One major ferry, massively overdue. A new one that's already out for repair. Another one which doesn't fit the harbour it's supposed to sail from. New ferries being built overseas and not here in Scotland. And an ageing fleet which breaks down, leaving islanders feeling like second-class citizens. This is a mess that has been 2 decades in the making. It has been a shameful episode in Scotland's devolved political chapter. And I never have and never will ever make an apology for raising it in this chamber. I move the motion in my name.
Thank you, Mr Green. And I now call on Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop to speak to and to move Amendment 20957.3. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, this debate is helpfully timed to allow me to build on yesterday's statement to Parliament. Yesterday, I chaired a meeting of the Ardrossan Task Force to discuss next steps. This morning, I met with CAMAC to discuss its response to the operational challenges and with CMAL to discuss the various vessel and port investment projects I referred to yesterday. And finally, I had the pleasure of visiting the newest addition to the fleet, the MV Isle of Islay. The motion asks for a 30-year investment plan. I can confirm that we published the island's connectivity plan, vessel and ports plan in May, setting that out our plan to 2045. It is based on an assumed vessel operational life of 30 years and commits that we will reduce the average age of the total fleet to around 15 years by the end of this decade. Additionally, we have committed that the plan will be fully updated every 5 years so that there is always that 20 to 25 years forward look. This plan is well underway. In addition to the MV Isle of Islay, her 3 sister ships are under construction, along with 7 small vessels, and I had an update on that from CMAL only this morning. And the MV Glen Rosa, when that is added to the fleet, that will mean 1/3 of the entire CalMac fleet is being replaced. The plan also commits to providing a major vessel for resilience purposes until at least 2030 to minimise disruption and ensure services are maintained. I announced yesterday that the replacement of the MV Lord of the Isles will soon move to tender, and the proposal to directly award 2 of the small vessels replacement scheme to Ferguson's Marine. And we will soon be making an announcement on the replacements of Northern Isles freight vessels. And I would say to Jamie Green, all those steps that we will need to carry out for CMA engagement and all the subsidy control and all those actions will be taking place for this award proposal, and we are far more confident that we'll be able to do it this way, and that is why I have announced that yesterday. I also confirmed that I have approved funding for Port Ellen developments, and I'm pleased to confirm that CMAL will be awarding the £107 million contract to completely redevelop Port Ellen this week. And regarding Ardrossan, those negotiations around purchase and wider legal agreements have now been concluded and will be signed shortly to confirm the purchase by CMAL this month, and that was obviously discussed last night in the task force. Beyond that, we will continue to invest in new vessels and ports. Our programme of community needs assessments is underway. The outputs will inform future service design and the business cases for that pipeline of vessel and port projects. And it's not just about new vessels or ports, it's also about how they are run. We are approaching the end of the first period of the new Clyde and Hebrides ferry services contract following the direct award to CalMac in October. Now, these arrangements are a step change in how services are delivered, intended to bring flexibility and community focus to the heart of operations. And as I discussed with CalMac only this morning, that's part of a process and journey, and this constant learning of embedding those KPIs in every part of their business. For the Northern Isles ferry services, I can confirm that this morning we published the prior information notice as the initial phase in procurement for the next contract, which will be in place from end of June 2028. And of course, the introduction by this Government of road equivalent tariff has significantly reduced ferry fares on the Clyde and Hebrides network and saves ferry travellers around £25 million per year, and will fully retain RAT for islanders and non-islanders alike. And on the question of fares, Ariane Burgess raised the question of freight fares across the network yesterday. She highlighted not just the absolute level of freight fares, but also their relative value. And I can confirm that starting this summer, Transport Scotland will undertake a review that will encompass exactly these issues. Of course, I can't prejudge the outcome of that review, but I hope that confirmation is welcome. We recognise that island businesses have experienced more than their fair share of disruption. That's why we created the Islands Business Resilience Fund and expanded its scope to include Coll, Tiree, the Small Isles, Mull, Iona, Ulva, Barra, Battersea, Isla and Jura. And it was essential that the fund remained tightly targeted so that the support was credible. I can confirm that the full £4.4 million will be deployed, and I can announce today that we have uplifted the rate of awards to strengthen the resilience of small businesses facing impact of disruption. This all sits alongside the vision of the National Islands Plan, which sets out a refreshed programme of actions to address the challenges and opportunities facing our islands more broadly. Presiding Officer, I recognise the challenges that island communities have faced and the need to provide them with reliable and resilient services, which is why we are taking this range of actions and will continue to invest in those communities. And I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Sue Webber to speak to and to move Amendment 20957.2. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'm pleased to speak in support of the motion lodged by Jamie Green on fixing Scotland's ferries fiasco, and I also move the amendment in my name. For too long, Scotland's islands and coastal communities have been treated as an afterthought by this SNP government. Lifeline ferries are not a luxury. They are not a seasonal extra. They are essential infrastructure. They are the arteries that keep island and coastal economies alive, connecting people to work, education, healthcare and family. Yet Scotland's ferry fiasco has been going on since 2014. The two vessels at the heart of the scandal, the MV Glensanix and the MV Glenrossa, were originally budgeted at £97 million. Their combined cost has now reached almost £500 million, and both were meant to be in service in 2018 and 19. Instead, islanders have endured years of delay, disruption and uncertainty. The MV Glensanix finally entered service in January 2025, and it's already required multiple periods of repair. The MV Glenrossa has been delayed again, with delivery pushed back to the very end of 2026. The most recent delay alone adds another £12.5 million, with the cost of completing the vessel since nationalisation now standing at £197.5 million. And what do islanders hear from ministers? We hear that the government is carefully assessing the information provided. We hear that the situation is a source of great frustration. But frustration is not accountability. Careful assessment is not delivery. Not a single minister has resigned or taken responsibility. And this is why my amendment explicitly notes that the combined cost of the Glensanix and the Rossa has reached almost £500 million. Taxpayers deserve to know how that was allowed to happen and how ministers will ensure it never happens again. Yesterday, the Scottish Government announced 4 direct awards to Ferguson Marine, a programme to upgrade the yard and an intention to return it to the private sector. If that is the strategy, then ministers must clearly outline how these new vessels will be delivered on time and on budget. Warm words and press releases will not rebuild public trust. Meanwhile, CalMac has spent more than £260 million over 11 years maintaining an ageing fleet. In 2024-25 alone, upkeep costs reached £50.1 million, double what they were just 2 years earlier. The average age of a CalMac Lifeline vessel is now over 25 years old. In 1974, the typical ferry was just 13. That is not progress, it is managed decline. Communities such as Dunoon and Ardrossan have faced repeated disruption, yet many local businesses are not eligible for compensation under the Islands Business Resilience Fund, despite clearly being affected. This is unfair and must be rectified. The Government has also set out its intention to purchase Ardrossan Harbour in a very timely announcement yesterday, I would say. If that deal proceeds, ministers must provide regular updates on when the purchase will be completed and when the long overdue upgrade will be delivered, because communities deserve clarity and certainty, not continued speculation. In Ardrossan, the MV Caledonian Isles was out of action for 20 months for repairs costing nearly £12 million. On Arran, the MV Alfred has been chartered at a cost that has already reached £35 million, more than double what it cost Pentland Ferries to build the vessel. And that figure... I won't, Mr Gibson. I've got very limited time and quite a significant amount to carry on with. That figure will rise now further that the charter has been extended. And that's not strategic fleet management, it's short-term crisis management. Island and coastal communities have experienced repeated timetable changes, cancelled sailings and the absence of a real resilience vessel when breakdowns occur. Public services, local businesses, tourism and supply chains have all been hindered by this mismanagement. The question is simple. How will the Scottish Government hold the ferry service providers to account to ensure they deliver for islands and coastal communities? Islanders and taxpayers deserve transparency, they deserve competence and they deserve better than this. Let me be clear. No one in this chamber doubts the dedication of workers at Ferguson Marine or the crews operating our ferry services. They are doing their utmost in extremely difficult circumstances. The failure here is not theirs. It lies with ministers who have presided over years of delay, poor oversight and a lack of forward planning. What Scotland needs now is a credible long-term strategy. We need a rolling 30-year plan for ferries and ports infrastructure so that no community is ever left again without a viable lifeline service. In conclusion, it is time to fix Scotland's ferry fiasco. It's time to restore trust. Thank you, Presiding Officer. Thank you,
Ms Webber. I now call on Rhoda Grant, who is joining us remotely, to speak to and move Amendment 20957.1. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And as the Cabinet Secretary said, we had a statement yesterday which tried to draw a line under the ferry fiasco, but sadly it did not. We're still seeing prolonged dry dock periods for both the new ferry and the older vessels in the fleet. Making pre-election promises does not cut it with communities who have suffered years of disruption. People missing health appointments, missing weddings, missing funerals. People have to leave for events earlier than required just to be sure to make appointments. And this adds costs and takes money out of the pockets of islanders. Businesses struggle, losses mount up for local businesses. Haulage providers are disrupted and every aspect of island life is impacted. We call for fines levied on CalMac for contract breaches to be used as a resilience fund to support impacted island businesses. Instead, a one-off fund was created. The way this was set up caused more division than by pitting community against community. The division is also caused due to some routes being given more priority than others when it comes to getting the best boats when the disruption happens, or indeed having their timetable disrupted at all. This certain uncertainty means that services fail and businesses face increasing costs. We've seen businesses leave the islands because they can't work in these operating conditions. Indeed, it's only the resilience of these businesses and their commitment to their communities that we've seen them continue to operate under these conditions. However, they cannot do that indefinitely. It impacts on the hospitality industry. Bookings are cancelled. Tour companies no longer take bus tours to many of the islands because there is nothing they can do to accommodate 40 people when a ferry has been cancelled at short notice. This has a dire impact on the economy of our islands and increases depopulation. We have a government that says it's trying to stop depopulation, but in practice, it's their actions or inaction that is actually causing it. What is really wrong at the core of this government is that its motto is put off until tomorrow anything you can't be bothered doing today. The ferry fiasco shows the danger of this approach because to put right these omissions takes longer and many more resources in the future. The whole of Scotland is suffering from this approach, be it health or education. This approach has seen citizens let down. Presiding Officer, Scotland needs a government that is not afraid to act, that does not put off until tomorrow what really needs to be done today. A government that will put in place a sustainable rolling programme of ferry replacements to ensure that our island communities are never left in this position again. Presiding Officer, that's what Scotland needs. And I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you, Ms Grant. And I now call on Maggie Chapman to open on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful to the Liberal Democrats for bringing this important debate to the Chamber today, because Scotland's island and coastal communities deserve much better. Today, I want to focus on a specific injustice that often goes unmentioned, the cost of freight, and I acknowledge and appreciate the comments from the Cabinet Secretary in her opening remarks. We often talk about passenger fares, and rightly so, but it is the cost of transporting freight on Scotland's ferries where the real inequality bites for our island and coastal communities. That's when those ferries run at all. Put simply, the cost of ferry freight adds roughly 30% to the cost of building a home on our islands. 30%. That's not a rounding error. It's a structural injustice baked into island life. Yesterday, my colleague Ariane Burgess highlighted here in this chamber the stark disparity in pricing. Large motorhomes can cross a ferry at about a quarter of the cost of a truck bringing building materials, food and essential goods that communities depend on. Across the network, commercial fares are far higher than for motorhomes. But the disparity is inconsistent. On the Oban, Craignure and Lochaline Fishnish routes to Mull, commercial fares are 3 times higher than motorhomes. On Tiree, they're 22% higher, 27% higher on Barra. Why is an HGV heading to Mull 3 times the price of a motorhome, while to Arran, a similar distance, it's only twice as expensive? It makes no sense, and it is not fair. This is not just a logistical or accounting problem, it is an equalities issue, and it is fuelling depopulation across our islands. Scotland faces a housing emergency, and island communities are in no way exempt. In many ways, they bear its full weight. When the cost of building materials is inflated simply because of freight charges, affordable housing becomes almost impossible. Councils, community housing enablers and housing associations just cannot deliver at the scale communities need. The result? People living in unsuitable homes, growing waiting lists and rising homelessness. This disproportionately affects women, people on low incomes and young people trying to stay in the communities they grew up in, as Rhoda Grant has already alluded to. The ferry freight system is not neutral. It concentrates disadvantage. We cannot seriously address depopulation or the housing emergency in Scotland's islands while these freight charges remain unreformed. High freight charges ripple through the cost of every staple good: food, healthcare supplies, energy. Island residents are paying more than their mainland counterparts, and people with disabilities face particular hardship when medical equipment, mobility aids or care supplies are subject to inflated freight costs. There is an effective postcode lottery for basic human needs, and it should be unacceptable in the 21st century Scotland. So what do we want? Scottish Greens have been calling on the Scottish Government to commit to a review of commercial freight charges. This review must aim to apply a fair pro rata charge for all vehicles. It must remove the punitive costs currently applied to commercial traffic. It must consider the impact on housing delivery so we confront the 30% premium that makes island house building unnecessarily difficult. And it must reform pricing structures to reflect social need, just as passenger fares have been reformed, and examine the equality impacts on island communities. In closing, Presiding Officer, Scotland's island communities are not peripheral. They are central to who we are. We will not retain vibrant, equitable communities if we allow freight charges to price out affordable housing, price out small businesses and widen inequality year after year. And this is just one element of Ferry's infrastructure and Ferry's strategy that we need to change and get right. So a review of freight charges is needed, and I am grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for confirming today that this review will happen later this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. We now move to the open debate. Backbench speeches of up to 4 minutes. I call Beatrice Wishart to be followed by Kenneth Gibson. Ms Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Ferries are critical infrastructure for Scotland's islands. Islands that are, according to the Scottish Government social media posts, central to Scotland's future. No community should be left without viable lifeline services and experience the ferries fiasco outlined in the motion. We heard again today, just coincidentally at lunchtime at the Island CPG convened by Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, the criticality of reliable ferries to island communities. It won't come as any surprise to the Chamber that I'm going to focus my contribution in this debate to the Northern Isles. The Transport Secretary said yesterday that Transport Scotland receiving 1,100 responses to the Northern Isles ferry service consultation was, quote, substantial for a project of this nature. In contrast to the Cabinet Secretary, I'm not surprised by how many responses were received. In 2023, I undertook a survey on the Northlink passenger service. It received over 1,000 responses. I sent the results to the Scottish Government and Transport Scotland and received lukewarm platitudes. Yet the issues raised in respondents were the same in 2022. I've not got any time, I'm going to continue. Yet the issues raised by respondents were the same in 2023 as Transport Scotland reported in 2025. I first raised the seasonal fares policy in 2021, and the scrapping of peak seasonal fares for islands on the Northern Isles ferry service will be a relief for island residents who rely on the Lifeline service all year round. The unfair fare structure became untenable after peak rail fares were scrapped. The Scottish Government, however, didn't seriously engage on the issue until recently, and it doesn't escape the notice of islanders that this announcement comes just before an election. There are many other ongoing issues with the Northern Isles ferry service which the Government could address if it was so minded. I've long called for a new rolling system of bookings. Cliff edge dates beyond which bookings are closed makes forward planning difficult, while at the same time islanders are advised by the operator to book well in advance. Passengers struggle to secure bookings for cabins on the dates they need to travel, and even more so if they need to take their car. The complexities of transporting time-sensitive freight exports from Shetland constrains local businesses and their ability to expand. High-level produce from Shetland, like seafood or livestock, need to get to market on time. Transport haulage companies in Shetland have told me of their investment and time required to navigate the limitations of freight capacity and meet customer demand. Work needs to be done now to procure extra tonnage to address this while the tender process is underway for the new Freight Flex vessels, as it will be years before those new vessels are in service. Meanwhile, despite me raising it repeatedly, Transport Scotland seem to be caught out each autumn by the requirements of the annual livestock sales, with little evident forward planning. A prior long-standing policy of shared cabins... I've got no time, sorry. Our prior long-standing policy of shared cabins was for many a cheaper, more comfortable way to travel. Initially suspended due to COVID-19, they never returned. The removal is continually raised by my constituents, and I've repeatedly put that to the Scottish Government. I've never received a satisfactory answer as to why the change became permanent. No consultation took place with the community. The nebulous comment that it relates to safety doesn't hold up to scrutiny, given both the concerns raised about the behaviour of some passengers in the communal sleeping areas and the acknowledgement and seemingly tacit approval by ministers, the operator and Transport Scotland of social media pages for passengers to arrange shared cabins themselves, thereby ensuring any operator liability for this arrangement is negated. The removal of shared cabins is a troubling indictment of the lack of consideration for and understanding of the needs of those who rely on this service. Islanders in receipt of concessionary vouchers for 2 free return journeys have in essence had their entitlement halved as a consequence of the change of the shared cabin policy. When I've raised this issue, Transport Scotland and the Scottish Government simply say a voucher covers a pod or a chair, but that consistently fails to recognise that those with concessionary vouchers often have the greatest need to lie flat for a 14-hour voyage on the North Sea. There's so much more I could say on ferries, but time is not on my side. But to conclude, islanders don't ask for special favours, but to meet lifeline needs, they must have reliable ferry services.
Thank you, Ms Wishart. I now call Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Edward Mountain. Mr Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I first want to pay tribute to Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop. Today was her last speech after 27 years serving her constituents and this Parliament, 17 of them in government. A woman who gets things done. A redeveloped Ardrossan Harbour, serving flourishing communities, will be one of our many positive legacies. We'll miss you, Fiona. Presiding Officer, I'll discuss some of the ferry problems impacting my own constituents, as it's important to recognise those. But it's also important to recognise that there have been real and tangible improvements in our ferry services since 2007. Across the network, passenger and car numbers pre-pandemic were 25% and 43% up respectively. And that was thanks to the introduction by the SNP government of road equivalent tariff in 2014, which I campaigned for to ensure inclusion of the Clyde Islands. Return fares from Ardrossan to Brodick today are £10.20 return for passengers and £41 for cars. When Labour and the Liberal Democrats left office, it was £10.30 and £75 19 years ago. Had these fares risen with inflation, trips to Arran would be completely unaffordable. That's the reality of Labour Lib Dem ferry policy. RET's implementation was visionary. Cheaper fares boosting employment and businesses in many fragile island communities. And in 2007, Brodick only had one service, backed by the geriatric MV Saturn for 6 weeks each summer, during which an average of 14.2% of sailings were lost due to mechanical failure. How things have changed since. We saw £32 million invested in Brodick Harbour. Arran's Lachranza service has improved markedly with 6 Sunday return sailings to Clondalkin and Tarbert in winter, instead of just one on the much bigger MV Katrina, increasing the visits to Lachranza, its distillery, the rest of Arran, boosting local employment. However, exacerbated by increasing demand, we cannot gloss over substantial problems. Arran has seen constant vessel redeployment and timetable changes, with far too few sailings from Ardrossan. Reliance on Troon last year meant fewer sailings and longer journey times. It curtailed day tripper numbers, making it more difficult for islanders to attend mainland hospital appointments, funerals and visit family. Supply chains and commuting patterns, including NHS and care workers travelling to Arran, were disrupted. Yesterday and today saw all Ardrossan sailings cancelled as the MV Caledonians developed yet another technical failure, barely 5 months after returning from previous repairs. The Glen Sannox has been out for more than 4 months for warranty works, and vibrational issues must be sorted out for both that vessel and the Glen Rosa. However, to put this in context, even in 2025, one of the worst years I can recall for disruption, there were more sailings to and from Brodick than in any year Labour and the Lib Dems were in office. For Cumbria, CalMac proposes to change the way the route has functioned for 40 years and double vessel turnaround time. Health and safety was recently cited, but it wasn't in 2024 when the Cabinet Secretary vetoed an identical move. One Islanders again want rejected, and one Cumbria Ferry Users Group and I will discuss with the Cabinet Secretary next week. With Ardrossan Harbour safely back in public hands, millions of pounds will be invested in redeveloping it to deliver the regular, accessible and reliable ferry services Arran needs, bringing prosperity both to the island and Ardrossan. The Cabinet Secretary at last night's Ardrossan Harbour Task Force meeting is already committed to delivering compensation to businesses impacted when Ardrossan Harbour undergoes full redevelopment. Scottish ministers will outline who will qualify in due course, together with the resource allocation. It would be helpful if the Liberal Dems could explain in closing which communities, such as Dunoon and Ardrossan, mentioned in their motion, should be compensated now as they propose, the mechanism for delivery, how much it will cost and from where in the budget funding should be found. In addition to the MV Isle of Isla, shortly due to enter service, 11 vessels are currently under construction. This will increase CalMac's fleet capacity, improve reliability and strengthen network resilience. Presiding Officer, it's not been easy for our island communities in recent years, but with record investment in CalMac operating more sailings to Arran, serving more routes than ever before, the future now looks brighter.
Thank you, Mr Gibson. I now call Edward Mountain to be followed by Richard Leonard. Mr Mountain.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I'd like to thank the Liberal Democrats for bringing this debate to the Parliament this afternoon, and particularly to Jamie Green. He and I have shared many committee meetings over the last 10 years looking at 801 and 802, which is what I want to concentrate on today. Now, Presiding Officer, at school, I seem to remember when we were talking about history, we were talking about Henry VIII. We were taught a little rhyme which went, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Well, when it comes to the teaching of the way the government handled 801 and 802, we will be reminded that it was resigned, replaced, repurposed. And the one R that's missing in there when it came to any ministers or anyone within Transport Scotland or CMAL is the fact that no one, but no one, was removed. And, Presiding Officer, I'm sure I don't need to remind you of the many ministers that have presided over the ferries fiasco. We had Derek Mackay, we had Hamza Youssef, we had Graham Day, we had Jenny Gilruth, and we had Kevin Stewart, and we had Fiona Hislop, who on her second incarnation when it comes to ferries seems to be doing a lot better. We had Cabinet Secretaries in the form of Michael Matheson, Murray McCallan, and now again Fiona Hislop. Now, in all of the time that I've looked at ferries, presiding officer, I haven't seen anyone be fired for this fiasco. And I don't need to remind you, because Parliament's already been reminded, that it was 2015 when the contract was awarded, and in 2017 when the floating, as it appeared at that stage, bathtub, which was then to become the Glen Sannox, was launched. Now, what we knew when those contracts were awarded, that most yards across the world were working on 5-stage payments when it came to ferries. But, oh no, the Scottish Government decided to work on 18-stage payments. So when the yard was eventually nationalised, we'd paid £82 million of the £97 million, and we didn't even have a ferry that was fit for purpose. And that got progressively worse. We ended up now, as we've been told, with £460 million of money being spent on the ferries, with additional loans to Ferguson Marine of £15 million and Ferguson Marine again of £30 million. Interestingly, that the two loans, no one knew they were going ahead. They sort of went ahead independently. So if you look at the total money spent on Ferguson Marine yard, it's about £1.5 million per employee. Just let that sink in. £1.5 million per employee. Now, do I begrudge a bit of that? Not a bit of it, in the sense that it's not the employees that are the ones at fault here, but the management and the fact that the government has failed to manage it. Let me be clear, if they think they can argue that we've got value for money, when the Glen Sannox was insured, presiding officer, the other day, it was insured for £50 million. That's the rebuild cost. And we know that it's cost 4 times that amount. £50 million is what the market says it would cost to replace the Glen Sannox. And how much have we paid? So my question at the end, as we come to the end of this debate, who's lost their job? Anyone in Transport Scotland? Not a bit of it. I can point to 1 or 2 civil servants that have moved sideways and then been promoted into other jobs. I can point to a few ministers that have moved sideways and been promoted into another job. 1 or 2 ministers also that have disappeared out of the Parliament for other reasons, but we won't go into that. And what have the islanders got for this? Well, they've lost out, haven't they? They've lost business, they've lost care, and they've genuinely lost out. And for that, this Parliament should be ashamed. And I do hope the government will hang its head when it comes to this very fiasco in the future. But before I close, presiding officer, I would just briefly like to say I've appreciated the companionship of Fiona Hislop in this Parliament. I've enjoyed working with her, not always with her, sometimes against her, but she's always done it in good humour, and it's made my time in the Parliament the richer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mountain. I now call on Richard Leonard to be followed by Stuart McMillan. Mr Leonard.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I remind members of my voluntary register of trade union interests? It never ceases to amaze me that something just as distinctively as quintessentially Scottish as our islands and the ferry links to them, which are a social and economic necessity, have been treated so badly by the Scottish National Party government. From the former First Minister, famously telling BBC's Glenn Campbell, "I didn't say don't go ahead," on the ordering of vessels 801 and 802, to the current First Minister in an email exchange on the same subject, which, by amazing grace, once was lost but now is found, confirmed the absence of banana skins. And in between, we witnessed the Scottish Government being sued by the Scottish Government, or at least the ferry company which the Scottish Government is the sole shareholder of, in a dispute over the Northern Isles route. And when I hear the Conservatives wrapping themselves in their arid ideology and spouting their dry dogma, obsessed with private enterprise and the free market, I say to them gently, Ferguson Marine is in public ownership because private ownership failed. In fact, because of persistent pressure from this Parliament's Public Audit Committee, the Government has been required to bring in the accountant...
Mr Leonard, please resume your seat just a second. I'm looking at 2 members who are having a conversation across the benches from sedentary positions, which is disrespectful to the member who has the floor. Mr Leonard, please continue.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Let me return to this point. Because of persistent pressure from this Parliament's Public Audit Committee, the Government has been required to bring in the accountants, Grant Thornton, to conduct a forensic audit to track down exactly where £124 million of public money went when the yard was in private ownership. Yesterday in Parliament, I asked the Deputy First Minister when that forensic audit will be published, but didn't get an answer. So I asked the Government the same question again today. When will this forensic audit be published? There is another wider point I want to make about private ownership, which is this. When I saw information on ferry delays and cancellations recently from the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, I was told in a written answer released just 2 days ago that, I quote, Western Ferries and Pentland Ferries are both privately owned and operated companies, so the Scottish Government does not hold this information. And I might add, neither are they within the current scope of freedom of information laws, which Katie Clark is giving this Parliament an opportunity to reform. So there is a real lack of transparency and accountability over the delivery of public services paid for by public funds. Which leads me to the Northern Isles ferry routes operated by Serco. Passenger revenue is up over the last decade by 40%, but public subsidy is up nearly 300%. So what we have is a monopoly. The question is, do we want it as a private monopoly or a public monopoly? Finally, if I've got time...
Briefly,
yeah.
Jamie Halker-Johnson.
I'm grateful for Richard Leonard. I always enjoy listening to him speak. But can I tell him, as an islander, and I think I would speak on behalf of many islands in the Northern Islands, we would be worried about having CalMac running the service in the Northern Isles, and we don't want it a public organisation like CalMac running it.
Richard Leonard.
Well, that sounds a bit more like some of the old ideology I was referring to earlier on. But let me turn finally to the Labour amendment, which highlights that there is a democratic deficit here. And it's not just about seats on boards. I've never believed that nationalisation plus a seat on the board was socialism. What we need, and what we already have the powers in this Parliament to do, is to give much greater control to island communities, but also to delegate more responsibility to the workers engaged, whether it's the crews who operate our ferries and ports or the workers at Ferguson's who are building our ferries. That is something which I hope the next Parliament will do. Invest in our communities, invest in our fleet, invest in our people, and drive out once and for all the profit motive and the shareholder dividend from the provision of these lifeline services.
Thank you, Mr Leonard. And I call Stuart McMillan. Mr McMillan.
Thank you, President Officer. First, I want to apologise to you and to Richard Leonard and the Chamber for my part in the secondary discussion earlier on. Also, I want to touch upon Fiona Hislop, with Kenny Gibson said earlier that this is Fiona Hislop's last debate. Fiona was one of the class of '99 and has certainly had a very distinguished service in the Scottish Parliament. And I want to thank her for everything that she has undertaken in her time in the Scottish Parliament. And she certainly, when she leaves Parliament, our Parliament will be, and the country will also be in a better place for having her as part of the parliamentary process. So thank you. Also want to just highlight the fact that my wife works part-time for CalMac, as I usually do when I speak about ferries. So yesterday's announcement by the Transport Secretary and the Deputy First Minister regarding the 4 new vessels to be built at Ferguson Marine, in addition to the purchase of Ardrossan Harbour, which my colleague Kenny Gibson touched upon earlier, was something he's lobbied consistently for over many years, helps actually shape today's debate. And like my Ayrshire colleague, I've been persistent in my lobbying for Ferguson Marine, because it isn't just a constituency issue, it's a personal matter for me also. I've said it before, but this also is another opportunity to do so again in the Chamber. That when my father passed away, he was an employee of the yard, and the workforce were very supportive of our family. And I've never, ever forgotten that, and I never will. And I know that my family were very grateful to the workforce for their support at that time. And my support for the yard goes back so long before I was elected, but also certainly during the Westminster election campaign of 2005, I was the SNP candidate for Inverclyde, and I started the campaign at that point to try to save the yard. And during the campaign, the then Labour Lib Dem Scottish Executive awarded the Fishery Protection Order to Remontoa in Poland. And the situation at the yard was so severe that the yard actually laid off 100 workers. And in minutes of a Cabinet meeting on the 1st of June 2005, the then Lib Dem MSP Ross Finney, who was the Environment Minister, he was also the one who signed the contract off to go to Remontoa. The minutes stated, and I quote, the yard had declined to a state that was close to irreversible. When politicians fail to acknowledge the challenges faced by the yard long before 2014, they do the workforce and also the yard an absolute disservice. Now, Ferguson's has lived more than 9 lives, and I dare say it's going to live many, many more. There will be many twists and turns in the Ferguson's journey. But if it does, that means the yard is still building ships and creating opportunities. And let's be no doubt, but for the actions of the SNP Scottish Government in 2014, but then also in 2019 when it was nationalised. And I didn't hear anyone support the nationalisation in their comments today. But when it was nationalised, if it wasn't nationalised, we would now have Newark apartments sitting beside Newark Castle in Port Glasgow instead of a shipyard. The jobs would have gone, the opportunities would have gone, and all that would be remembered of a once proud tradition would be the Skelpies 100 metres away. But I never want the SNP Scottish Government to apologise for saving hundreds of highly skilled, quality jobs in Port Glasgow. And I will never, ever apologise for lobbying to save our yard and for lobbying to get work into our yard. And what many people, including some in the Chamber, forget is that no matter the well-documented issues regarding the Glen Sannox and Glen Rosa, some of which actually are true, I hasten to add, the yard has launched 5 vessels since the Scottish Government took the yard into public ownership. There are many aspects of what's happened at the yard that have been regrettable, to say the least. And I've shared many a frustration with the shop stewards, John McMonigal, who has since retired, Kenny Meakin, who has taken on John's role, and also Alex Logan. And I'm saying also the strength and resolve of Alex Logan is just absolutely immense. His belief in the yard and the workforce has now been rewarded. And I hope that the management actually repay his and also the entire workforce's loyalty and commitment by delivering the yard that we can all be proud of. Now, in closing, Presiding Officer, yesterday's announcement was a categoric show of support that Port Glasgow will still be building ships. And that certainly is something that I am delighted with, something I'm proud that this SNP government are doing. And I also know that the workforce are delighted, their families are delighted. And I really am looking forward to taking that message to the constituency, to the voters in this election in May. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr McMillan. And we now move to closing speeches, and I call on Katie Clark to close on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to close this debate on behalf of Scottish Labour about Scotland's vital ferry services and to thank the Liberal Democrats for bringing this motion forward. As many members have highlighted, our ferry network has become increasingly unreliable and inaccessible in recent years, and delays and cancellations have become a regular occurrence, with an ageing ferry fleet and decisions about the ferry network that often fail to take the views of islanders and workers into account. Jamie Green and Kenneth Gibson have already referred to the significant disruption over recent years on the Ardrossan to Brodick route. And that has been to the extent that islanders and indeed tourists haven't been able to rely on the service, which has been a massive problem both for Arran and also Ardrossan, which is serviced, and indeed some islanders have moved away from the island. The Glen Sannox and Glen Rosa were chosen to service this route, as Sue Webber said, at an original estimated cost of £97 million, yet the cost was estimated to stand at £380 million as of last year. And as Sue Webber also said in her contribution, unofficial estimates now put the cost nearer £500 million. The Glen Rosa has still not come into service on the route and is not expected to do so until the end of the year at the earliest. But despite the Glen Sannox coming into service last year, it has been plagued with problems and is now being repaired with parts stripped from the Glen Rosa. This has led to the unacceptable situation where there have been no ferries running on the route for several months last year. Services were also temporarily transferred to Troon, and anyone who has used the service there will be aware of the accessibility issues for disabled passengers and anyone with mobility issues, and of course longer journey times for all passengers. And just this week there was no crossings on the route because of an issue with the Caledonian Isles. Despite all this disruption to the people of Ardrossan and Arran, there has been a failure to adequately compensate communities, and it would be helpful to hear more from the Cabinet Secretary on some of the comments she's made today in relation to compensation. I warmly welcome the work that's been done in relation to public ownership of Ardrossan. It's been over a decade since the Strong Local campaign, which forced the Scottish Government to commit to the redevelopment of the harbour, but successive transport ministers had resisted the call to take Ardrossan Harbour into public ownership, and it's very clear to me that a significant amount of work has been undertaken by the Cabinet Secretary, who both took the decision in principle that it was acceptable to bring the harbour into public ownership. I will give way to the member in a moment, but also, indeed, that negotiations have got to this point. I'll give way to Kenneth Gibson. I don't know if I'll be able to get any time back.
For you taking an intervention, is it not the case, in fact, that the reason that it took so long is because Peel Ports were not willing to negotiate, and indeed the Scottish Parliament doesn't have the power to ensure a compulsory purchase order on the harbour?
Katie Clark.
Well, I agree with the member, and indeed it's the point I've made many times that the private owner have been extremely unreasonable, but I think that's been clear for many decades indeed in terms of some of the other issues with that private owner, and was very clear, I would say, a decade ago, which is why, for example, North Ayrshire Labour Group has been campaigning for a decade for municipal ownership or some form of public ownership. As I said, previous Transport Secretaries didn't think that was possible, and quite often ridiculed people like myself that were arguing for it, and I very strongly welcome and support the decision that's been taken by the Cabinet Secretary, and I very much hope that whoever is in that role after the election will have the same drive to ensure that progress is made to redevelop Ardrossan, because I'm sure it's not going to be straightforward. I know that she said that there was an Ardrossan task force meeting, I think she said last night or this morning, and it would be helpful to get more details in terms of what decisions have been taken, because there's a great deal of concern that despite this announcement, which has been made just before an election, that there may not be speedy progress, and it may be many, many years before we have a fully operational ferry service at Ardrossan again. So anything that the Cabinet Secretary is able to say to give comfort and to give more detail would be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Clark. And I call on Jamie Halker-Johnson to close on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I also add my thanks to Fiona Hislop for all her work? Although there's a few things I need to get her to sort and look at before she rides off into retirement. One of the most important things we've heard from some people today is the voice of communities who have been affected year after year by the ferry disruptions. Many of us, particularly in the Highlands and Islands, have heard first-hand on too many occasions about the direct consequences of this government's failure for communities and constituents. Maybe it's easy to forget down here in Edinburgh how many of these communities that rely on lifeline ferry links are already disadvantaged. They're rural communities, generally remote, very often islands. They deal with challenges of geography, of distance, of low population density, some of depopulation, others of attracting working-age people and businesses to their communities. Businesses in these places, in the places that, like I call home, work on lower margins and have greater struggles getting deliveries, and in the case of the visitor economy, attracting customers. The blow of an unreliable ferry service and the increase in isolation and economic harm that brings are all an extra burden for these places to bear at a time the Scottish Government talks in grand terms about making these communities attractive, sustainable places to live and work. Too often, members of the SNP benches have been dismissive about those concerns. There have been plenty of occasions where opposition members have risen with a question about ferries and been met with a groan from Central Belt MSPs who simply don't understand or care about our island communities. Briefly, yes.
Australia.
Another member who lives on an island who has raised these issues very frequently. Will he also accept that there was much as we may agree on the problems that have been with the ferry services, that there was important announcement yesterday about the replacement of the Lord of the Isles, which should be welcomed.
Jamie Hawker-Johnson.
I feel like Dr Allen was looking for an endorsement there ahead of the election. I mean, I do recognise that there's some good news. I do. Sorry.
Mr Stewart, please let Mr Hawker-Johnson continue.
It wouldn't be a debate without Kevin Stewart shouting something from a sedentary position, would it? You know, we do welcome the good news, but it doesn't make up for 19 years of complete failure with our ferries. And too often, and we've heard many of these issues about procurement. And the truth is the future of our ferry routes is shrouded in mystery. There is no real forward planning for the capital expenditure needed to keep the fleet afloat, the billions of pounds that will be required right across Scotland, and no clarity even over when the Scottish Government intends to pay for. We have ferries run by private enterprise, something obviously certain members of opposition benches over there are not great fans of, by local authorities, by the Scottish Government through CalMac, and of course put out to tendering like with Northlink. And the argument over fair funding between the CalMac inter-island fleet in the Western Isles and the Northern Isles inter-island routes run by Orkney and Shetland councils was made and ostensibly accepted by the SNP. But do they equally accept the argument that capital expenditure on vessel requirement for council-run services must be treated in an equitable way as a matter of principle? Will fixed links be seriously considered on a sensible basis that reflects additional benefits of a tunnel or bridge on routes where that is realistic and wanted? In the Highlands, the locally run Corran Ferry was again suspended a fortnight ago after the half-century-old historic vessel that serves as its backup, the Maid of Glencool, required maintenance. Highland Council are going to have to seek an extension to its maintenance schedule to keep it running, while the main vessel, the MV Corran, sits awaiting parts. The problem highlighted here is that we have ageing vessels and absolutely no resilience or flexibility in the system for when they fail. A new electric vessel for the Corran Narrows is due for delivery in 28-29, but there is a desperate need for a replacement now. And as the fleet across Scotland gets older, this will be the reality on more and more routes. More and more failings, greater and greater costs for repairs and servicing. We've also heard from my colleagues Sue Webber and Edward Mountain about the delays to the Glenrosa at Ferguson's, a saga that continues to roll on but not roll off. In the Scottish Government's backslapping on Ferguson's yesterday, the island communities that the boats will have to serve seemed of secondary importance to SNP ministers. And yet those communities would be justified in their concerns that their new vessels are to be built by a company that the Scottish Government clearly has more confidence in than the Scottish public or islanders themselves. Because confidence in Ferguson's or this SNP government is a luxury that my constituents don't have. They're suffering the economic and social costs of unreliable services, ancient vessels and reduced timetables right now, and the costs are falling on the communities least able to shoulder them. As my colleague Sue Webber highlighted, this fiasco was not inevitable. It was a result of this SNP government's mismanagement. And Edward Mountain laid that failure out in detail, and that no one's lost their job, and that ministers should hang their heads. Presiding officer, in conclusion, I have no doubt that islanders and others in ferry-dependent communities have lost out and suffered real harm from the Scottish Government's failures. While jobs and businesses will have been lost, it is telling that not a single SNP minister has lost their job. However, these communities, like everyone in this chamber, knows the blame doesn't lie in council headquarters or the workers of Ferguson Marine or the ferry operators and their hard-working crews. It lies squarely at the door of this government.
Thank you, Mr Hawker-Johnson. I call on Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop to close on behalf of the Scottish Government. Up to 4 minutes, please.
This morning I met CalMac and Seamal in Inverclyde and visited the MV Isle of Islay as it prepares to enter service. And this follows my series of announcements and delivery updates across ports and harbours yesterday. This is an opportunity to note more publicly my thanks to the teams across Seamal, CalMac and also Northlink for their ongoing work to deliver services, as well as the complex work behind the scenes to deliver these improvements and projects, working for and alongside island communities. If members do not vote for this amendment from the Scottish Government, they are not showing support for the specific measures set out in it. Ardrossan Port being brought into public ownership and being redeveloped for the people of Arran. Port Ellen being developed for the people of Islay. The proposal to direct toward 2 of the small vessel replacement programmes to Ferguson Marine, the competitive tender for the new MV Lord of the Isles, and the removal of peak fares for islanders in the Northern Isles travelling in Northlink ferries. With a family of 4 travelling from Shetland and a car and a cabin could save up to £193 per return journey. And on fares, it is this SNP government who brought in the road equivalent tariff in the Clyde and Hebrides network, saving passengers around £25 million per year. For example, on the Stornoway-Ullapool route, single fares before RET in 2008 were £15.30 for a foot passenger and £75 for a car. Without RET, they would now be £25 and £128 respectively. But RET means they are only £12.30 and £66. And I've always been clear that following the Clyde Hebrides Ferry Services 3 direct award, that we would turn our attention to further potential reform of the governance of Scotland's ferry bodies. As part of the new Clyde and Hebrides Ferry Services contract, we have already amended elements of the governance arrangements between Scottish ministers and CalMac. The new arrangements allow and indeed require Scottish ministers to more closely supervise and directly intervene to improve the Clyde and Hebrides ferry services. And can I say to Jamie Green specifically, direct award to Ferguson's may require this further. Now, we will consider further reforms, including any necessary to support direct award and maximise the opportunities around public services reform. However, as I've always been clear, alongside any consideration of reform, we also need to ensure that the focus remains on delivering new tonnage, improving our ports and bedding in the new contractual arrangements for the Clyde and Hebrides Ferry Services contract. Scottish ministers also remain committed to ensuring island communities shape the future of Scotland's ferry services. We continue to work with public bodies to widen the reach of board appointment campaigns across island communities. And, Presiding Officer, I suspect that this will be my last speech in this Parliament after 27 years of elected public service, and I'd like to thank MSPs for their kind remarks. But I want to state how much I believe in a strong Parliament as well as good government. Both need each other for accountability, but also in constructive public policy development. My experience on the Education Committee and its early years inquiry as an opposition member 20 years ago helped shape my drive for expanded early education and childcare hours and universal free school meals pilots when I was Education Secretary. Similarly, my 2 years on the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee as a backbencher, keeping Edward Mountain in check as his deputy convener, and our ferries inquiry has informed my work as Cabinet Secretary for Transport. And I think you should see that in what I have delivered and what I announced yesterday. So to all MSPs, defend the strength of this Parliament, be a responsible opposition and support governments when they invest in our communities and drive and deliver improvements. So in supporting the amendment, you'll be supporting all the investments I set out yesterday, investing in our island communities. And I thank members for their remarks earlier on in this debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I now call on Jamie Green to wind up the debate on behalf of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. Can I, first of all, pay credit to that great and incredible final speech from Ms Hislop. I know it's been warmly received by members across the chamber who have clearly today shown a huge amount of respect and value to the time she's spent in public service. And I think from our benches, we'd like to thank the Minister for that very much so. Thank you. I do want to move away from some of the statistics that we talked about in the opening part of the speech and more into really the human cost of what a lot of these issues have meant to people. Because I think they probably come as a source of regret to all of us who've had our inboxes filled over the years. For many of the reasons I mentioned, the Glen Sannox operating out of Troon instead of Ardrossan, the hiring of the MV Alfred, no doubt at great cost to the government, money that I'm sure would have rather spent elsewhere, and the issues that I've raised around small businesses being out of pocket and therefore the compensation scheme that's been required of them. I do reiterate calls that I would like to see extended where possible, but also to take into account those coastal communities, like I mentioned previously in other speeches, like Ardrossan, whose small businesses are affected by that lack of footfall, because if the ferry's not operating, the passengers are not there, the people aren't there, and they're not spending their money. Now, I appreciate money doesn't grow on trees, but we also should note that a huge amount of money has been spent on repairs over the last 10 years on an ageing fleet, and no doubt some of that money would have been better spent supporting the small businesses affected by cancellations. Yesterday, of course, we heard that welcome news that the harbour will come under the control of CMAL and de facto public ownership. The Cabinet Secretary will know fine well that by supporting her amendment, it effectively deletes the premise of my motion. But I do want to put on the record that I do support the government's moves on Ardrossan. I do support the announcements made by the award of contracts to Ferguson Marine and Port Glasgow, and I do hope that the government can get through some of those issues that allow them to make that offer as soon as possible, and they will have the support of these benches in doing that. Of course, all of this could have been done years ago, I would argue. Mr Hamza Youssef once promised to purchase Ardrossan Harbour, but to Ms Hislop's credit, once again, she's finishing that job that Mr Youssef clearly didn't start in the first place. But there is another issue that's come out as we talk about the issue of ferries, and that's this juggling act that I think so many of us have come to get used to, unfortunately. And it's those emails that we get in our inboxes week after week from their head of communications, someone who's quite well known to some people on the front benches of the government. But what that's pointed clearly is that those updates are as confusing as they are frequent. And it's telling us, as MSPs, informing our constituents which vessels are broken at any given day or week, which route is having to lose a secondary vessel to another route, or which return of a vessel has been delayed due to further repairs and engineers, and indeed which island will be left suffering as a result of that constant juggling act that CalMac are forced to do. I also suspect there's a fair amount of frustration within CMAL itself, because Transport Scotland seem to be making the decisions and pulling the strings, but it's ministers who control the purse strings. Now, this Parliament has debated over this issue of this tripartite mess over the years. That is a problem that should have been resolved and overhauled years ago. That's what the Rural Economy Committee back in 2020 concluded in a report which I and Mr Mountain penned, but nothing seems to have actually changed since then, and that is an issue that the next Parliament will surely have to grapple with. I've talked many times in this Parliament about the frequency and volume of cancellations, but it's not about the sailings that are cancelled, it's about the people who should be on them that I fear for the most. My inbox and any MSP who represents an island community will have harrowing stories of the human impact of cancellations. People are missing urgent hospital appointments, they are missing funerals, the farmers are missing getting their cattle to market. Young students are missing exams and valuable education. People are missing mental health appointments. Now, these are not abstract views. These are real examples of casework that I've had to deal with over the years. And our islanders have always understood that the weather has not always been kind to them and not always will be kind, particularly on the West Coast. But what adds to their frustration is when those cancellations are surely due to technical delays to ageing vessels. And that is where that sense of palpable frustration has come through over the years. It's been tragic to read some of those stories, which is why I do believe that we do need a rolling 30-year ferry replacement strategy and a port strategy. But the reason I mention it in a different light to the tone used in the government's amendment is that that strategy cannot be at risk to the whims of ministers or changes of government. In my view, it must and should be underpinned by legislation, and therefore it removes it from any form of political convenience or expedience. It moves it out of those political cycles that we're so used to debating in here. We need a complete restructuring of the governance of Scotland's maritime strategy. CMAL, CalMac, Transport Scotland, operating in a current triangle of confusion, with lines of accountability blurred and decisions about services being made miles away from the communities that they affect the most. Ferries are transport infrastructure, like roads, like bridges, like airports and trains, and we should treat them as such. Presiding Officer, in closing and in response to the words of Ms Hislop, I do also believe in working across the political divide when it's appropriate and when it's necessary. In my 10 years as an MSP, that's how I've always worked. Consensus, through agreement, through compromise, those have been my watchwords, Presiding Officer, and I hope that my record demonstrates that. And it is in that spirit I'd like to offer the next Scottish Government some collegiate advice. The 2018 Islands Bill that we passed will be meaningless on paper if we cannot connect our islands in the first place. So this next Parliament will have to find a way of working together to find long-term solutions to connecting every town, village and island in Scotland, because no one, nowhere should be left behind by their Parliament or their government, but especially so our islands. Presiding Officer.